The Ukrainian defense forces have driven the Russians out of key positions in Steenohhersk, Zaporizhzhia region. We will soon show you epic footage of the clearing of this important stronghold from the occupiers. Ukraine has created its own guided aerial bomb. The first guided bomb has already undergone combat testing and is ready to strike the enemy deep behind their lines. Organization of combat deployment. Belarus has announced the start of joint nuclear exercises with Russia. What are the two dictators planning? Nothing will be left of them. Trump is losing patience and is actively planning new strikes on Iran. Let's talk about all this and more in detail right now, and please don't forget to like this episode. Friendly drones attacked Russia's Kstovo. This is in the Nizhny Novgorod region, where oil refineries and oil pumping stations are located. In the Kstovo area in particular, there is the Lukoil Nizhny Gorod Nefteyorg Syntez oil refinery, which was targeted by defense forces with drones in April, as well as the Starolikevo linear production dispatch station, which is part of the Transneft network. Demilitarization and denazification in Russia have reached Moscow. Now it's unclear what state Big Pooh, covered in soot from the capital's fires and with gloomy eyes, will be in as he flies to Beijing to bow before Xi Jinping. And here's a good question. How will he fly? After all, the capital's airports in the Russian Federation are now almost constantly under threat from Ukrainian drones, and flights are being cancelled due to Operation Carpet. Or maybe Putin, like before his infamous parade, will ask Zelensky for permission to take off. How the war is returning to where it started? Details in our report.
What is this?
Guys, honestly, I never thought this would affect our city, Zelenograd. Basically, we're being bombed. I never thought the war would touch us like this. I just never thought it would happen.
Ukrainian drone operators send their regards to Moscow's air defense forces. The war has knocked on the windows of residents in the capital and the Moscow region. More than 100 drones attacked Moscow's oil refineries, military facilities, and bases. According to Muscovite eyewitnesses, Russian air defense missed the drones and hit civilian homes instead.
Where are they falling?
Where? There, look. And where did it fall?
It just... basically the local air defense systems unfortunately hit the residential building right next door.
In Moscow and the Moscow region, there are reports of several dead and dozens injured. The mutual shelling with Kiev is Putin's choice, who, after a 3-day ceasefire on May 9th, resumed strikes on Ukraine.
These are entirely justified responses to Russia dragging out the war and striking our cities and communities. This time, Ukrainian long-range sanctions reached the Moscow region, and we are making it clear to Russians their state must end its war.
On May 14th, the Russian army struck a residential building in Kiev. A Kak-101 missile destroyed the entrance and killed 24 people. On May 17th, the Ukrainian armed forces struck military facilities in the Moscow region involved in the production of cruise and ballistic missiles.
They chose the most unexpected direction, a rearward direction. The entire strike on Moscow came from the northwest direction, almost from the north, starting from Dubna. And Dubna is a plant where they produce, well, it's a city where MKB Raduga is located, an enterprise that manufactures cruise missiles.
After Dubna, explosions were heard in Zelenograd. There are two major producers of advanced microelectronics for missiles in Russia. One of them is the Bryansk plant Kremlin L. It was struck by the Ukrainian armed forces in March. The second is AO Angstrom. Ukrainian drones struck it on May 17th in Zelenograd.
A well-coordinated strike. Everything comes, so to speak, from one direction. Moreover, this direction was prepared for the strike because it was reported that supposedly partisans from the Attrition movement disabled several communication towers in the areas of Putilkovo, Komunarka, and Domodedovo.
Another target was Sheremetyevo Airport. The drone raid halted operations at Moscow's air hub.
The strikes were carried out accordingly on the runway of Sheremetyevo airfield. It should be noted that at the time of the strikes by Ukrainian UAVs, air traffic over the Russian capital was blocked and more than 300 flights were cancelled.
A similar attack is an opportunity for the Ukrainian armed forces to probe Moscow's air defenses and gather intelligence for future, more massive attacks involving both drones and long-range missiles. The press secretary of the head of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov, was asked an uncomfortable question about why Russia needs nuclear weapons if it can still be attacked. This question was asked by the Russian propagandist Zarubin. Peskov replied that Russia supposedly needs nuclear weapons in order to prevent a threat to its existence. At the same time, he assured that nuclear deterrence is an integral part and the cornerstone of Russia's national security.
This inevitably raises a question, I think. But here we have these powerful bombs. So what? It turns out that a nuclear power can be nibbled at and even bitten?
Well, look, but you can't threaten a nuclear power, you can't threaten its existence. This is what allows us to be confident in this, and this is the basis of nuclear deterrence. Nuclear deterrence is an integral part and the cornerstone of our national security as a whole.
Specifically, the threat to the country's existence.
Of course.
And supposedly, joint nuclear exercises with Russia have begun in Belarus. The military is practicing covert movement, as well as the delivery of nuclear warheads and preparing them for use. Also among the stated objectives is to check the readiness of equipment and weaponry, as well as to practice combat use from unplanned deployment areas. At the same time, the Belarusian Ministry of Defense solemnly assures that the exercises are routine and do not pose a threat to neighboring countries. Let me remind you that earlier, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated that Lukashenko had contacts with Russians who are trying to persuade him to join the war against Ukraine. Meanwhile, nuclear weapons are once again at the center of attention. Russia is increasing its capabilities and continues to issue threats. But while Putin is resorting to nuclear blackmail, his army is preparing a new offensive. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia is currently actively considering plans for military operations against the Chernihiv-Kyiv direction from the territory of Belarus, as well as working out scenarios for an attack on one of the NATO countries. How realistic is a new large-scale assault? Is Moscow really ready to cross the nuclear line? This is what we will discuss next in the report.
Russia is capable of launching a nuclear strike at any moment and at any distance. This was stated by the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov. But he immediately adds, this is not a matter of technical capability, but of a political decision. And most importantly, there are currently no signs of preparations for such a strike.
Scare tactics about nuclear weapons were already around back in 2022, when Medvedev openly told everyone that, God forbid, if something hits Crimea, there would be a nuclear strike on Ukraine, or even on Europe, something like that. Well, the first ones did hit, I remember, on August 9th, 2022, the first missiles arrived. Then the SBU guys launched their Siba-B drones into Sevastopol Bay, and a lot of other things happened. That's why we'll keep hearing this from time to time, because the Russians have no other argument.
Nevertheless, Russia's nuclear potential remains a serious threat. Analysts note that Moscow is ramping up its capabilities at the fastest pace since the Cold War. This is not just about missiles, but also about a general increase in military presence near NATO's borders. Russian authorities are also actively using nuclear rhetoric. In particular, Vladimir Putin has spoken about the need to ensure strategic security and has mentioned new missile systems that can carry nuclear warheads. According to experts, such statements are a form of pressure and intimidation.
Risks of using nuclear weapons? Well, such risks always exist. But I think we need to understand a simple thing. If the Russians believed that using tactical nuclear weapons would immediately lead to Ukraine's capitulation, and that they would face no consequences for it, say from China, the US, or other nuclear states, then they would have done it long ago. So we will keep hearing this. But I think that first and foremost, China is categorically against this, and they have honestly warned the Russians not to mess around.
At the same time, Russia is preparing new strikes against Ukraine. According to President Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian intelligence has obtained documents indicating preparations for missile and drone attacks. Among the targets are nearly 24 sites, including political centers and military posts. Ukraine is already responding. The defense forces are strengthening protection and preparing both military and sanctions-based responses. The president notes, every Russian strike will have consequences. At the same time, there remains another risk from Belarus. According to Ukrainian authorities, Russia is trying to involve Minsk in new operations. This refers to possible actions both against Ukraine, particularly in the Chernihiv-Kyiv direction, and against NATO countries. Infrastructure is already being created on the territory of Belarus that could be used for an offensive. However, according to Ukrainian border guards, there are not enough forces there for a full-scale attack. Despite all the threats, Ukrainian authorities emphasize that the key factor remains the state's ability to resist. because it is this and not attempts at intimidation that determines the real balance of power and the course of the war. Ukraine will undoubtedly defend itself and its people if Alexander Lukashenko makes a mistake and decides to support this Russian intention as well.
They will keep firing at you until the end of the war. Our task, well, what strong leverage do we have? Here it's really just about responding. Retaliatory strikes, attacks to destroy oil and gas infrastructure, and much more, just to make the Russian economy collapse.
Therefore, the nuclear scenario remains possible but not inevitable. Russia continues to exert pressure, threaten, and prepare new strikes. But the decisive factor still remains not weapons but political decisions and Ukraine's ability to defend itself.
Units of the unmanned systems forces have begun using unguided rockets launched from long-range drones combined with a 60-kilogram warhead on a strike wing. This was reported by the commander of the UAV forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Robert Madyabrovdy. According to Defense Express, this unique modification will radically change the tactics of deep strikes. In the new configuration of the Ukrainian drone, 2 blocks of unguided aerial rockets are mounted on each wing, with 4 rockets in each block, providing a total salvo of 8 rockets. The new model has already been used against actual targets of the occupiers. The drone, equipped with a new interface and targeting reticle, fired rockets at a strategic secure communications hub of the Russian Black Sea Fleet near the city of Mirny in temporarily occupied Crimea. However, the main purpose of creating this rocket-equipped configuration is specifically to combat the mobile fire groups of the Russians. These very groups hunt Ukrainian drones and cover the enemy's air defense, so they must be destroyed or forced to retreat even as they approach. The Orthodox Russian oligarch Konstantin Malofeev apparently knows something and has also decided to backtrack. He stated that losing to Ukraine is not shameful, since supposedly it is populated by the same Russians. This statement is already being interpreted as an attempt to prepare Russians for future military failures.
Losing to Ukraine is not shameful. After all, Ukrainians are, in essence, actually Russians, just like us. And Russians never lose and never surrender.
Meanwhile, key locations in the city of Steenohhersk in the Zaporizhzhia region have already come under the control of Ukraine's security and defense forces. This was reported by the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. During the operation, carried out in close coordination with neighboring units, assault troops from the special unit Artan conducted a series of active offensive actions aimed at driving Russian occupiers out of the city and stabilizing the situation in the settlement. The vehicle carrying the Artan assault groups to storm the occupiers' positions was targeted by an enemy FPV drone, but the drone was destroyed. As a result of fighting in difficult urban conditions, Russian occupying forces were driven out of their fortified positions. Key locations in Steenohhersk have come under the control of Ukraine's security and defense forces. The assault operations were carried out in a coordinated manner, utilizing aerial reconnaissance and precision fire strikes. Every house was checked for surprises and any remaining enemy personnel. We do not rule out that the enemy will continue trying to re-enter the city, but we are prepared for this, noted Artan unit commander Viktor Tarkatyuk. Putin's army has completely lost the initiative and the ability to conduct serious offensives. We'll talk next about how the armed forces of Ukraine are driving out the occupiers.
Ukraine continues to scorch the Russian rear.
The skies, of course, are mostly well under the enemy's control. That's a fact. Everyone says that now, and that has never changed at all.
This time, Ukrainian drones targeted aviation, air defense systems, logistics, and Russian army facilities, both in the occupied territories and within Russia itself.
During the night of May 15th, unmanned aerial systems carried out 55 strikes on 23 military targets and facilities deep within enemy lines. Taganrog, Yeysk, and the temporarily occupied territories of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia regions, including Berdyansk, Melitopol, and others.
Among the targets hit was a Russian amphibious aircraft, the B-200 Altair, whose cost may exceed $40 million. A K-27 helicopter was also struck. In addition, Ukrainian forces hit Torem-2 and Pantsir S-1 air defense systems, a cargo ship carrying ammunition, and a Russian military training center.
These are the 16th and 17th enemy air defense elements destroyed by the birds of the unmanned systems forces from the 1st to the 15th of May. In total, during the period of air defense attrition from December to May, the unmanned systems forces have already destroyed 153 air defense units, 108 surface-to-air missile systems, 39 radar complexes, and 6 electronic warfare complexes.
The occupiers are also taking heavy losses on the ground. According to CNN, the past few months have been the first in a long time for the Russians, when the pace of their offensive has essentially come to a halt, and Ukrainian forces have begun gradually reclaiming their territories. Moreover, this is not just about local successes. According to the American Institute for the Study of War, in April, Ukraine liberated more territory than Russia was able to capture.
So far, these are only minor territorial changes. However, this very trend is problematic for Russian President Vladimir Putin, who for years has been convincing both Russians and the international audience of Russia's inevitable victory.
Even across the border, they admit their own fiasco.
This kind of war is a war of attrition. So many Russians are dying, or yes, irrecoverable losses. These are also the maimed, are guys who become disabled naturally, without arms, without legs, who can no longer fight. These are the dead and the missing. Who is going to fight? Who?
And the key role in this turning point belongs to Ukrainian drones. The front is so saturated with drones that any movement of equipment or personnel becomes deadly dangerous. And the previous tactic of slow, creeping advances, which Moscow used to try to push through the front, has collapsed.
Kyiv had successes before, such as the major counteroffensive in the summer and fall of 2022, or the incursion into Russia's Kursk region. But they have not yet won the war for Ukraine. Ukraine may not win, but it is losing much less than Russia.
We're no longer talking about isolated strikes, but about a systematic campaign that is changing the very architecture of the war. Ukrainian forces are operating on several levels at once, from the front line to deep in the operational rear, targeting logistics, air defense, and key elements of military infrastructure.
Without a doubt, the necessity of waging this war has forced Ukrainians to develop new tactics, new methods, a hybrid asymmetric warfare. If you look at the numbers, Russia is losing 5 times more soldiers per month than Ukraine. At the same time, Ukraine is a smaller country and accordingly has a smaller army. Although the armed forces of Ukraine are now the strongest and most powerful military force in all of Europe. This needs to be clearly understood. Obviously, this is largely thanks to the assistance they receive, but also due to the combat experience they have gained.
And if just yesterday the Kremlin's narrative of inevitable victory was shaping the agenda, today the question is how quickly the Russian Federation will fall.
The first Ukrainian guided aerial bomb, created with the support of the Brave 1 defense cluster, has passed all necessary tests and is ready for combat use. The Ministry of Defense has already purchased the first experimental batch of munitions, and Ukrainian pilots are practicing scenarios for their use, according to Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. The KAB is equipped with a guidance and aerodynamic control system, which significantly increases target strike accuracy compared to conventional free-fall bombs. The main advantage is the ability to launch it from tens of kilometers away from the target without entering the enemy air defense zone, as noted in the Ministry of Defense's statement. According to the developers, the Ukrainian bomb has a warhead weighing 250 kilograms and is intended to destroy fortifications, command posts, and other targets deep behind enemy lines. The Ministry of Defense stated that the first combat use could take place in the near future. There's no smoke without fire. Rumors about a possible offensive against Ukraine from Belarus have a real basis. And the Belarusian dictator himself, having dropped the mask of a neutral peacemaker, announced a partial mobilization of Belarusians and ordered preparations for war. How will Ukraine respond to this? Robert Madyar Brovdi has already responded.
Lukashenko has dropped his mask. The Belarusian dictator is preparing a second front for another Russian advance on Kyiv. Rumors about preparations for an invasion have turned into real actions, as personally stated by Volodymyr Zelensky on his social media page.
Russia is considering plans for operations in directions to the south and north of Belarusian territory, either against the Chernihiv-Kyiv axis in Ukraine or against one of the NATO countries.
Lukashenko himself no longer hides his desire to go to war. During a high-level meeting with his top Belarusian generals, the leader made it explicitly clear that his entire army should now prepare for a major offensive.
There's no way forward without a ground operation.
Thus, Belarus is refusing to conduct large-scale exercises. Instead, partial mobilization is being introduced in the country.
We will selectively mobilize units, the armed forces, in order to prepare them for war.
Moreover, Lukashenko is not limiting himself to just Ukraine. According to intelligence, the Belarusian dictator, with the support of the Russian army, is considering the option of invading one of the Baltic states.
It will be the seizure of a small, specifically a small area of one of the Baltic countries. And the calculation is based on the idea that this seizure will force European countries into a dilemma. Either start a full-scale war with Russia, in which case Eastern Europe, at least its capitals and infrastructure, will become targets for Russian missile and drone attacks, or try to make peace without any guarantees.
Meanwhile, the Ukrainian armed forces are already on alert and are expecting provocations on the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. Our defenders have turned Policia into a fortified defensive line. Currently, kilometers of field fortifications, hundreds of revetments for equipment and firing points have been built there. A branch system of minefields, ditches and barriers has also been created, according to the military. So a repeat of the February 2022 scenario is unlikely. And as analysts assure, despite all the maneuvers and loud statements, in reality, Lukashenko is unlikely to dare to attack Ukraine.
There are no significant troop groups on the border with Ukraine, and there is no large-scale mobilization. So for now, all of this exists only at the level of scare tactics. So for now, in fact, we do not see any movements toward the border, any serious groupings, and we are ready for defense.
But the Belarusian army is clearly not ready for an attack. By getting involved in a military conflict with Ukraine, Lukashenko could lose his country. And that's not just a figure of speech. When faced with well-trained and highly motivated Ukrainian fighters, his army doesn't stand a chance. On the very first day, hundreds of drones will fly toward Minsk and Gomel, and the regular army will easily cross the border and march toward the Belarusian capital.
And suddenly Ukraine enters. Several battalion tactical groups come in hard, take out those unprepared for defense, those professional Marines who are only ready to invade foreign territory, crush the conscript border guards who have never participated in combat at all. And you could say this applies to the entire Belarusian army.
Not only will the Ukrainian army face little real resistance, but most Belarusians will gladly switch sides to join the Ukrainian armed forces and go on to overthrow their unchanging dictator.
Since Belarus is not a huge country and its population is quite homogeneous, mobilization and the need to die for the Russians could lead to a repeat of 2020 in the country, that is to massive protests. Protests involving millions, but this time with weapons in hand and without a powerful Russia backing Lukashenko. Because over these years, the Kremlin has squandered all its power, both economic and military.
So all the saber-rattling and loud provocative statements by Lukashenko about an impending war are nothing more than yet another information psychological operation and a tool of pressure, analysts assure. The mustachioed dictator regularly uses military rhetoric whenever he needs to bargain something from Russia: money, privileges, or political support. That's exactly what's happening this time.
It's clear that Lukashenko will wriggle out of this like, I don't know who.
Like a prickly hedgehog, a slithering snake, or really just about any other creature you can think of. Because he has absolutely no need to get involved in this war. The Belarusian economy has already fallen by 5% in this first quarter, while in Russia it's 4%. And it's only going to get worse because they're tied together. The situation is lousy, although...
Nevertheless, Putin continues to put pressure on Lukashenko.
We continue to observe Russian attempts to further drag Belarus into the war against Ukraine. We know that there have been additional contacts between the Russians and Alexander Lukashenko, aimed at convincing him to join new Russian aggressive operations.
So just in case, Ukraine is preparing for the worst, namely to repel an attack from its neighbors. And even though such a scenario is unlikely, it cannot be ruled out.
US President Donald Trump is increasingly losing patience with the peace negotiations with Iran, and the Pentagon has already prepared a plan for new strikes. CNN reports this, citing its sources. Time is running out for Iran, and they had better act quickly, or there will be nothing left of them. Every minute counts, Trump wrote on social media. He is expected to meet again soon with his national security team regarding this war. At the same time, according to sources familiar with the course of the negotiations, the Pentagon has prepared a number of military strike plans in case Trump ultimately decides to continue the attacks, including targeted strikes on energy and infrastructure facilities in Iran. At the same time, on the Iranian side, there are no new signs that senior officials are ready to back down. Donald Trump's mental health is now causing concern, not only among his opponents, but even among his fellow Republicans. This is one of the reasons for the increased preparations for the transfer of power. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is being named as the likely successor. If this scenario comes to pass, what will it mean for Ukraine and Russia? We will explain this in detail, so don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the YouTube channel Ukraine Today.
Donald Trump is likely suffering from a mental disorder but refuses to undergo a medical examination. There is still no official diagnosis, reports the German publication Zeit, which puts the overall governance of the United States at risk. A new wave of discussion was sparked by an incident in the Oval Office during a recent event dedicated to maternal health. Trump simply fell asleep in front of a huge crowd. At the same time, the White House, commenting on photos of the president with his eyes closed, claimed that in the pictures the leader was simply blinking. By the way, this is far from the first time Donald's team has had to justify his physical condition.
This is a minor irritation of the soft tissues from frequent handshakes and aspirin, which is taken as part of a standard cardiovascular disease prevention program. This is a well-known and harmless side effect of aspirin therapy. The president remains in excellent health, which I think you all see every day.
But Americans see something different, which they regularly report on social media. In recent months, Trump has increasingly displayed contradictory behavior. He makes harsh political statements, threatens to destroy other countries, gives strange public speeches, and shows signs of physical fatigue.
Swollen ankles, bruises on his arms that they try to cover up with makeup dragging his right leg, which he then swings forward. Constant cognitive tests, which Trump for some reason keeps bragging about. Although we still don't understand why he is tested for cognitive abilities so often.
Political analysts have pointed out that Trump's team has now unexpectedly collided with their very own campaign tactics, especially when Republicans used to relentlessly ridicule Joe Biden's health. In complete unison.
And now suddenly, they don't want the same for Trump. They don't like it. They say, that's enough, calm down, stop asking questions. 3 annual medical checkups in 8 months. 3 dentist visits in 5 months. Stop making assumptions. This is irresponsible.
But what most people consider irresponsible is something else. Leaving the United States without leadership or entrusting it to a sick person. That's why, as much as 2 years before the end of Trump's term, active discussions began about his successor.
Marco Rubio will try to run for president. He has a non-profit foundation or, a super PAC organization that continues to remain fully operational just in case it is required in the future.
Trump himself also spoke about Rubio's presidential prospects in his recent interview with The Hill. There, he called a Rubio-Vance ticket the ideal choice for Republicans in the 2028 election. At the same time, the guarantor refrained from directly endorsing any of the candidates. When weighing each of their chances of becoming president of the United States, it is worth noting that Vance supports Trump's position too actively, always and in everything. And considering that the current guarantor's approval rating is relentlessly declining, he will obviously drag JD Vance down with him.
His support is dwindling, his MAGA base is fighting among themselves, and the Republicans